The first time Jonas Calloway rode past her broken wagon, he told himself it was none of his business, and he almost believed it. It was a Tuesday morning in late September of 1874, and the New Mexico Territory was still wearing the last of its summer heat like a coat it refused to take off. The scrubland stretched in every direction, pale gold and rust-colored, dotted with juniper and creosote, and the sky above it all was the kind of blue that made a man feel small in the best possible way. Jonas had been riding this particular stretch of road between the town of Cimarron and his small cattle ranch for going on 3 years now, and he knew every rock, every bend, every dried-up creek bed along the way. So when something new appeared on the landscape, a covered wagon tilted at a miserable angle on the south side of the road, its left rear wheel shattered clean off the axle, he noticed it immediately. He slowed his horse, a big gray gelding named Colt, without fully meaning to. His eyes took in the scene the way a man's eyes do when they have been trained to assess situations quickly and without sentiment. The wagon was a proper homesteader's rig, canvas-topped and heavily loaded. A pair of sturdy brown mules stood in their traces, looking deeply unbothered by the whole affair, as mules tend to do. There were crates and a rocking chair tied to the outside, a cast-iron pot hanging from a hook beneath the wagon bed, and a collection of carefully wrapped bundles visible through the gap in the canvas at the back. And there was a woman. She was standing in the dirt beside the collapsed wheel, her hands on her hips, her head tilted as she surveyed the damage. She wore a plain blue calico dress that had seen considerable travel, and her dark brown hair had come mostly loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, falling in waves around her face and shoulders. She was not crying. She was not calling for help. She was staring at that broken wheel with the focused, furious expression of a person doing mathematics in their head, trying to figure out whether the numbers could possibly work in their favor. Jonas's hand tightened on Colt's reins. He was 31 years old, and in those 31 years he had learned a hard lesson that most men learn eventually, that getting involved in other people's troubles had a way of becoming your own troubles faster than you could blink. He had a fence to mend on the north pasture. He had a water trough that needed patching before the first freeze came in. He had a half-written letter to his brother in Texas that had been sitting on his kitchen table for 3 weeks because he could never seem to find the right words. He had things to do. The woman looked up then, and for just a moment their eyes met across the distance of the road. He could not make out the color of her eyes from where he sat on Colt's back, but he could see the set of her jaw, and it was the jaw of someone who was not going to ask for help under any circumstances, because asking had cost her something before, and she was not willing to spend that coin again. Jonas touched the brim of his hat in the universal language of the Western Territories, acknowledgement without obligation, and rode on. He told himself, as Colt's hooves raised small puffs of dust with every step, that someone from town would be along shortly. The road between Cimarron and the outlying ranches was well-traveled enough. Someone would stop. Someone always stopped. He told himself this for about 2 miles, and then he stopped telling himself things for a while and just rode, watching the mountains to the west go through their slow color changes as the morning light shifted. By the time he reached his ranch, unsaddled Colt, and started in on the fence mending, the image of the woman with her hands on her hips and that stubborn jaw had lodged itself somewhere behind his eyes like a piece of grit, and no amount of hard work seemed to dislodge it. She was still there the next morning. Jonas saw the wagon from a 1/4 mile off this time because he knew to look for it, and something in his chest did an uncomfortable small motion when he confirmed it was still there, still tilted, still wrong. He slowed Colt to a walk as he drew alongside it, and this time he had the opportunity to observe the situation more fully because the woman Maggie, though he did not know her name yet, was up on the wagon seat, going through what appeared to be a wooden box of tools and hardware with systematic intensity. The area around the wagon told its own story. A small camp had been made nearby, a fire ring of stones with a coffee pot sitting on a flat rock beside it, a bedroll that had been neatly rolled and tied, a bucket of water for the mules. She had spent the night out here, alone, on the open road in the New Mexico Territory in 1874, which was not a thing a woman did unless she had absolutely no other option or she had a considerable amount of iron in her spine. Possibly both. He could see now, in the clearer morning light, that she had attempted some kind of repair. There was a rough timber propped under the axle to keep the wagon from settling further into the dirt, and she had apparently removed the remnants of the shattered wheel and set them aside in a pile. She knew what she was doing, or at least she knew what needed doing, which was nearly as good. She looked up at the sound of his horse and watched him with dark eyes brown, he could see now, a warm, serious brown that carried no particular welcome but no hostility either, just assessment. The same look he had given the situation the day before, turned back at him. "Morning," he said, because his mother had raised him with manners even if the frontier had done its level best to sand them down. "Morning," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, not the voice of someone who had spent a frightened night alone in the scrubland, but the voice of someone who had slept reasonably well and was now focused on the problem at hand. He looked at the axle, at the timber prop, at the pile of broken wheel pieces. "Need a wheel," he said. It was not a brilliant observation, but it was accurate. "I know what I need," she said, not unkindly, just factually. He nodded. He looked at her tools box. He looked at the mules, who looked back at him with their characteristic flat philosophical expressions. He looked at the road ahead of him, which led to Cimarron, and then he looked at the road behind him, which led to his ranch. "Blacksmith in Cimarron could fit you with a new wheel," he said. "Ezra Howell, good man." "I know about Ezra Howell," she said. "I just need a way to get the axle there without losing the wagon entirely." He almost offered to help. He could feel the offer forming in his throat, like a word that wanted to be spoken. But something stopped him, the old self-protective habit, maybe, or the particular way she was looking at him that suggested she had already had too many men assuming she needed rescuing and not enough men simply helping when asked. He touched his hat brim again. "Good luck to you," he said, and rode on and hated himself mildly for the next several miles. She was still there on Wednesday. This time, Jonas had not intended to be on this road at all. He had planned to take the longer route around the eastern edge of his property to check on the cattle that pastured near the creek, but Colt had started favoring his left foreleg slightly, and Jonas had decided not to push him on rough terrain, which had brought him back to the main road, which had brought him past the wagon again, and he was no longer pretending that any of this was coincidence. She was not working on the wagon when he arrived. She was sitting in the shade of the wagon's tilted canvas on a small wooden crate, reading a book. An actual book, not a pamphlet or a newspaper, a proper bound volume that she held with the practiced ease of someone who read frequently. The coffee pot was on the fire again, the mules were contentedly chewing at something, and the whole scene had the paradoxical quality of being both stranded and settled. He stopped this time. Not for long, not with any particular plan, but he stopped and Colt stood still and Jonas said, "Still here, then." She looked up from her book. "Still here," she agreed. There was something almost amused in her expression now, or maybe it was always there and he was only now beginning to read it. "Did you send to town for the wheel?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Yesterday afternoon. Paid a boy from the Hendricks Ranch 2 bits to ride the message in. Ezra Howell says he can have a wheel ready in 4 days. He doesn't have one the right size in stock. 4 more days. On the side of the road." Jonas did the arithmetic quickly and without wanting to. "Where are you headed?" he asked. She studied him for a moment before answering, with the particular measuring look of a woman who has learned that information shared with strangers sometimes comes back to you in unpleasant ways. Whatever she saw in his face apparently passed some internal test, because she said, "I bought land, 40 acres south of the Cimarron River. I have the deed papers in my strongbox." He knew the area she meant. Good land, actually. Good water access, decent grass, backed up against a low ridge that would provide some wind shelter in winter. You're going to farm it, he asked. Ranch it, she said, with a quiet firmness that suggested this distinction mattered to her. I have 12 head of cattle coming from Santa Fe at the end of the month, and 2 horses. He looked at her more fully then, not rudely, but with genuine recalibration. She was not passing through. She was not on her way to join a husband or a family member who had already established something. She was doing it herself, from the beginning, which in the New Mexico Territory in 1874 was either an act of tremendous courage or tremendous stubbornness, and he was beginning to suspect it was both. That's ambitious, he said, and meant it as a compliment, though he was not entirely sure it came out that way. Most worthwhile things are, she said, and looked back at her book in a way that was a polite but definite indication that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. He rode on, but this time the image that lodged behind his eyes was not her jaw or her stubbornness. It was the book in her hands and the steady confidence in her voice when she said the word ranch. On Thursday, he brought her something. He had not planned to. He had been in the kitchen before dawn making coffee and telling himself very firmly that whatever happened to the woman with the broken wagon was her own affair, and she had clearly demonstrated she could handle her own affairs. But then his eyes had landed on the jar of beef stew sitting on the shelf, left over from his own cooking 2 nights ago, and he had thought about 4 days on the side of the road on provisions that fit in a wagon, and before his better judgment had a chance to vote, his hands had wrapped the jar in a cloth and tucked it into his saddlebag. He told himself it was simply decent neighborliness. He was going to be her neighbor after all, assuming she was telling the truth about the land south of the Cimarron, which he believed she was, because she had the deed papers in a strongbox, and people who are lying about deeds do not tend to have strongboxes. When he pulled up beside the wagon that morning, she was doing something he had not expected. She was sketching. She had a small notebook open on her knee and a stub of pencil in her hand, and she was drawing something he could not see from horseback. The morning light was doing something particularly fine with the landscape. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east were catching the first gold of sunrise, the scrubland was shifting from gray to amber, and a red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal somewhere overhead. He could understand the impulse. She closed the notebook quickly when she heard him, not guiltily but privately, the way you close something that is yours and not meant for general viewing. "You're back," she said, and this time there was a definite note of amusement there. "Passing through," he said, though they both knew the road went right past her wagon regardless of destination, so it was technically true. He reached into his saddlebag and brought out the cloth-wrapped jar. "Got extra stew. Figured you might be tired of whatever you're carrying." She looked at the jar for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, and he had a sudden cold fear that he had offended her, that she would take it as charity or pity, which it was not. But then she stood up from her crate and walked the few steps to where Colt stood and took the jar from his hand. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had a different quality than it had on the previous 2 days. Simpler, less armored. "Jonas Calloway," he said, because the moment seemed to call for a name and he had not offered one yet. She looked up at him. "Maggie Wilcox," she said, and then after the smallest pause, "I'm not someone who needs rescuing, Mr. Calloway." "I can see that," he said. "The stew is just stew." She held it against her chest and looked at him with those warm brown eyes that had been measuring and calculating every time he had seen her, and now for the first time they were doing something else entirely, something he could not quite name. "It smells good," she said. "I put sage in it," he said, which was not a thing he normally mentioned to anyone, and he had no good explanation for why he mentioned it now except that it was true, and the moment seemed to want truth in it. "I like sage," she said. He nodded. He sat on his horse for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he remembered himself and touched his hat and rode on, and this time the image that rode with him all the way to Cimarron and back was not her jaw or the book or the word ranch, but the way her voice had sounded when she said his name back at him. On Friday, he took the longer route. He had told himself, with a kind of internal sternness that he recognized as increasingly flimsy, that he was not going to make a habit of riding past her wagon. She was fine. She had a plan for the wheel. She had her stew. She had her book and her sketch pad and her 2 sensible mules and her strongbox with the deed papers inside. She did not need Jonas Calloway making a slow, regular circuit of her misfortune. But the longer route took him past a stretch of the Cimarron River where he sometimes fished in the evenings, and he happened to know that wild plums grew in thick clusters along the bank in late summer and early fall, and he happened to have an empty canvas bag in his saddlebag, and by the time he had filled it with ripe plums and was riding back toward home, the road past her wagon was simply the most direct path. He was beginning to be honest with himself, at least internally. She was not alone when he arrived. There were 2 riders stopped beside the wagon men from the look of them, rough-cut and road-worn, on horses that had been ridden hard and not particularly well cared for. Maggie was standing by the wagon wheel remnants, and her posture had changed from what he had observed on the previous mornings. She was standing very straight and very still in the particular way a person stands when they are trying to project complete calm, while feeling something quite different underneath it. Jonas put Colt into a trot without thinking about it. One of the men was talking, and as Jonas pulled up, he caught the tail end of a sentence about a woman alone on the road being fair game for company, which was exactly the kind of sentence that made Jonas's jaw tight. "Morning," Jonas said loudly, pulling Colt up between the men and Maggie with an ease that was entirely deliberate. He looked at the 2 riders with the particular flat, steady expression that said a great many things without saying them. "Didn't realize you fellows had stopped. Everything all right out here, Mrs. Calloway?" It was a swift calculation, the name he used. Not entirely honest, but the situation seemed to call for a certain creative geography of the truth. Maggie barely hesitated. "Fine, thank you," she said. "My husband came along just when I needed him." The 2 riders looked at Jonas, then at each other, and then one of them spat in the dirt and they both rode on without another word. Jonas watched them go until the road bent and took them out of sight, and then he turned back to Maggie. She was watching him with an expression that mixed relief with something sharp and self-aware. "I had it managed," she said. "I believe you," he said. "But there are 2 of them and 1 of you, and I was already on the road." He paused. "I should have stopped sooner." That last sentence surprised them both, he thought. It landed in the air between them with more weight than he had intended, carrying implications beyond the specific situation of 2 rough riders on a September morning. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "You brought something," she said, nodding at the canvas bag. "Wild plums from the river bank." He handed the bag down to her. "They're sweet this time of year." She opened the bag and looked in, and something happened to her face that he would think about later, in the quiet of his kitchen at night. A brief, unguarded softness, a crack in the armor of self-sufficiency that showed something more tender underneath. "I used to pick these with my mother," she said, to herself as much as to him, and then she looked up and the armor was back in place, but gently now, not defensively. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Jonas," he said. A small pause. "Jonas," she repeated, as though she were trying the word for size, and he thought it was the finest thing he had heard anyone say in a very long time. He stayed longer that morning. He was not sure when it happened, exactly the decision to stay rather than ride on, but somewhere between the plums and the story she told him about the 2 men who had been bothering her since she had stopped to water the mules at a creek 3 days back. She had sat down on her crate, and he had tied Colt to the wagon wheel and leaned against the side of the wagon, and they were talking. Really talking, not the careful, measured exchanges of the previous days, but the kind of conversation that has found its own rhythm and is moving forward on its own momentum. He learned that she was 27 years old and had been born in Missouri, but had moved westward by stages Kansas, then Colorado, then New Mexico, following something she described as a need to find a place that felt like hers. He learned that her husband, a man named Theodore Wilcox, had died of a fever 14 months ago, 2 years after they had married, and that she had spent those 14 months doing the arithmetic of grief and practicality, until she had arrived at the plan that had put her on this road with this wagon and those deed papers in the strongbox. He learned that she had a sister in St. Louis who wrote letters that alternated between concern and exasperation, and that she had a dog named Captain who had died the previous spring, and whose absence still caught her off guard sometimes. He told her about his ranch, the 320 acres he had been building since 1871, the cattle herd that had started with 8 head and now numbered close to 60, the house he had built himself from timber and adobe in the style of the territory, with a wide front porch that caught the evening light. He told her about his brother Robert in Texas and the letter he could not finish. He told her about Colt, who had been a half-wild thing when Jonas had first caught him, and was now the most reliable animal in 3 counties, which he felt was a story with useful implications about patience and stubbornness that he did not elaborate on aloud. He did not tell her that he had ridden past her wagon 4 days in a row without stopping, because he was not ready to explain the reasons for that, mostly because he was still figuring them out himself. He rode away that afternoon with the feeling that something had shifted, quietly but permanently, the way a river changes course in a flood, and then, when the water drops, simply goes in the new direction as though it had always meant to. On Saturday, the 6th day, the wheel arrived. Jonas learned this when he rode up to find Ezra Howell's wagon parked beside Maggie's, and Ezra himself, a compact, red-bearded man in his 40s who had the forearms of someone who had spent decades at a forge, was demonstrating to Maggie the precise method of fitting the new wheel to the axle with a cheerful instructional energy that suggested he found her an excellent student. Jonas pulled up and felt, for just a moment, something he recognized with some embarrassment as disappointment, which was ridiculous. She needed the wheel. The wheel was here. This was a good thing, and the feeling in his chest that bore some resemblance to a man who realizes that a reason for returning has been removed was something he was going to examine later and possibly set aside entirely. "Jonas Calloway," Ezra said, looking up with a grin. "I might have known you'd have found your way out here. Mrs. Wilcox tells me you've been neighborly." "Just passing through," Jonas said, which had become something of a private joke with himself at this point. Maggie was looking at him with those serious brown eyes and a smile that was still careful but had more warmth in it than the first day, considerably more. "Help us with this wheel," she said, "and I'll make you coffee." It was not the most romantic invitation he had ever received in his life, but it was the one that made him dismount fastest. The 3 of them got the wheel fitted in good order. It was a matter of lifting the axle with the timber prop, setting the wheel, and driving the linchpin home, work that was easier with 3 pairs of hands than 1 or 2. And afterward Ezra accepted a cup of coffee, and then excused himself with the air of a man who has assessed a situation, and decided to let it develop without his presence, which Jonas thought was diplomatically well executed. They sat with their coffee, Maggie on her crate and Jonas on an upturned bucket he had found in the wagon, in the long warm light of a late September Saturday afternoon, and this time the talking came even easier than the day before. There was a looseness to it, an ease, and Jonas was aware that it had been a very long time since he had talked like this with anyone, since the ranch had a way of making a man its own very good company for months on end, and he had let himself believe that was fine. She told him more about her plans for the land. She had thought about it carefully, years carefully, not just months. She intended to build a small house first, a proper one, before winter if possible, and then in the spring she would put in a kitchen garden for vegetables and start on a proper fence line for the cattle. She had saved money methodically for 3 years, supplementing what Theodore had left her by taking in sewing work in Denver for 1 winter, and teaching reading to minors' children in Colorado for another. She had the deed, she had the money for materials, and she had, as she described it with a very straight face, the considerable advantage of having nothing left to lose that she was not willing to lose. Jonas set his coffee cup down on the ground beside the bucket and looked at her across the small space between them and said, "You are the most determined person I have ever met in my life, and I say that as someone who once watched a woman in Kansas City argue a land agent into giving back money he had already spent, so the competition is real." Maggie Wilcox laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was, without any exaggeration or sentiment that he could identify as excessive, one of the finest sounds the New Mexico territory had ever produced. It started low and warm in her chest and came out clear and real, not the polite social laugh of a woman performing amusement, but the genuine laugh of someone genuinely delighted, and it changed her whole face. And Jonas sat on his upturned bucket in the September afternoon light and felt something solidify in him like cooling iron, quiet and permanent and warm. "The land agent deserved it," she said, when she had recovered herself. "He tried to short my sister on a claim her husband had paid for in full." "What happened to him after?" Jonas asked. "He moved to Utah," she said, with considerable satisfaction. Jonas shook his head, smiling in spite of himself, and they talked on through the afternoon until the sun had dropped low enough to turn the scrubland copper and bronze, and Maggie looked at the light and said she supposed she had better make camp and get an early start in the morning. The wagon was ready. The mules were rested. There was nothing keeping her on this road anymore. He stood up from his bucket and looked at her, and she stood up from her crate and looked at him, and the air between them had a quality he had not felt in a long time, something expectant and warm, charged with possibility, the particular electricity of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are each waiting to see whether the other will step forward. He almost said something that mattered, something real. He could feel it pressing against his teeth. But she was leaving in the morning. She had a plan and a deed and a destination, and she was not a woman who needed another man deciding what she needed. And he had not even, in 6 days of riding past and occasionally stopping and talking over coffee, actually asked her middle name or whether she preferred morning or evening or what she had been drawing in that notebook on Thursday. So instead he said, "If you have any trouble getting the wagon clear of the ditch, the Hendricks Ranch is about a mile east. They'd give you a hand." "I'll manage," she said, "but thank you." He touched his hat. She nodded. He untied Colt, mounted up and rode toward home, and the whole way there, 5 miles of scrubland and evening color, he had a conversation with himself that was more heated than most conversations he had with other people, and it ended, eventually, somewhere around the 2-mile mark, with a decision. He rode out on the 7th day before sunrise. He had slept badly, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a man who has made a decision and is impatient for the hour when he can act on it. He had made fresh coffee at 4 in the morning and sat at his kitchen table with it, looking at his unfinished letter to his brother Robert, and had written a short postscript at the bottom that said simply, "I think I met someone." He had then folded the letter, addressed the envelope, and set it by the door to take to Cimarron. He knew he might arrive to find the wagon already gone. She had said she was getting an early start, and he believed her, because she was a woman who did what she said she was going to do. He pushed Colt a little harder than usual, not a full gallop but a good long trot that ate up the miles, and when he came around the last bend in the road before the place where her wagon had stood for 7 days, he pulled up and held his breath. She was there. Not because of trouble, the wagon was fully ready, the mules were in their traces, the camp was broken down and everything packed and secured. She was standing by the front wheel, the new one Ezra had fitted, checking the linchpin with her fingers. She looked up at the sound of Colt's hooves and watched him ride up, and she was wearing a different dress today, a deep green one with a white collar, which meant she had specifically changed clothes for the journey and had presumably changed them this morning, which meant she had been here for some time before riding out. He stopped Colt directly in front of the wagon and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the early morning light was doing something extraordinary. The sky above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was streaked with pink and gold. The air was cool and smelled of sage and the coming day, and a meadowlark was singing somewhere off in the scrubland with an enthusiasm that seemed pointed. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said. "I thought you'd keep right on riding," she said. He swung down from Colt and stood in the road looking at her across the space of a few feet. "I've been riding past you for a week," he said, "and I'd like to stop. Properly, if you permit it." She was very still. The morning light was in her eyes, which were warm and dark and serious, and something else now, something he did not have a word for yet but hoped to. "What does that mean, exactly?" she asked, because she was a woman who dealt in specifics and always had been. "It means," he said, taking off his hat and holding it in front of him because it gave his hand something to do, "that I have 40 acres between my northern pasture and your land to the south, and I have been a quiet, unsociable man for longer than is probably good for me, and I would very much like to know what you were drawing in that notebook on Thursday." He paused. "And I would like to ask if I can call on you once you're settled, properly, with your permission." Maggie Wilcox looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and he could see all the things moving behind her eyes, the careful accounting of a woman who had been hurt and had rebuilt herself stitch by patient stitch, the wariness of someone who had been on the frontier long enough to know that men said many things and meant considerably fewer of them, the particular evaluating intelligence that had looked at him every single morning for 6 days and drawn conclusions he could not entirely read. And then she said, "I was drawing the mountains. The way the light hits them at different times of day. I've been drawing them all week because I'm going to live here and I wanted to understand what I was looking at." He nodded slowly. "And he said, and yes," she said, "you may call on me once I'm settled." He put his hat back on, and something in his chest felt lighter than it had in a very long time, lighter than he had had occasion to notice being heavy. "Can I ride with you?" he asked. "To your land, just to see you there safely." She considered this. "You're not going to try to carry anything," she said. "The mules and I have managed this wagon for 200 miles and were perfectly capable of the last 6. "I will sit on my horse," he said solemnly, "and ride alongside, and I will not touch a single piece of this wagon, its contents, or its harness." "Except in an emergency," she said. "Except in an emergency," he agreed. She nodded. She climbed up to the wagon seat with the fluid ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, gathered the mule's reins, and looked down at him with that careful, warming smile. "Then you'd better keep up, Jonas Calloway," she said. "My mules are faster than they look." They were not, in fact, faster than they looked. They were mules, and they maintained their own dignified pace without reference to anyone's schedule. But the 6 miles between the wagon's resting place and Maggie Wilcox's 40 acres of New Mexico territory were the finest 6 miles Jonas Calloway had ridden in 3 years. They talked the whole way, easily and with the comfortable overlap of people who have already done the work of becoming interesting to each other and are now simply enjoying the fact of it. She told him about her plans for the house adobe. She had decided, because it handled the temperature swings better than timber alone, and she had already spoken to a man in Cimarron about the labor. He told her about the winter of 1872, when the snow had come so early and so heavy that he had spent 3 days digging cattle out of drifts, and how after that he had built a proper covered area in the north pasture that he still considered one of his better decisions. When they came over the low rise that brought her land into view, Maggie pulled the mules to a stop and sat very still for a moment, looking at it. It was good land. Jonas had thought so when she had described it, and seeing it now with her beside him confirmed it. The river was visible as a line of cottonwoods about a quarter mile to the north, their leaves beginning their fall turn to gold. The grass was short but present, and the low ridge to the south cast a blue morning shadow across the near portion of the acreage. The land had a silence to it that was the silence of something that has been waiting patiently for its purpose. Maggie's face, when he looked at her, was something he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but a rightness, a deep recognition, the look of someone who has arrived at the place they were always moving toward and has found that it is exactly what they needed it to be. "Well," she said very quietly. "Yes," he said. She clucked to the mules and drove her wagon down onto her land, and Jonas rode alongside, and neither of them said anything more for a little while, because the moment did not need words. He spent that day helping her with her full and explicit permission to unload the wagon and establish a proper camp near the bank of a seasonal creek that ran through the middle of the acreage. He erected the tent he had brought from his own supply, at her request and under her direction, while she organized her belongings with a systematic precision that he found genuinely impressive. They worked well together. He had worked alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to share labor with someone, to find a rhythm with another person, and he discovered that with Maggie the rhythm came easily, that they moved around each other with a naturalness that seemed disproportionate to their acquaintance. They ate lunch sitting on the gate of her tailboard with bread and smoked meat from her provisions and the last of the wild plums from the canvas bag, and the sun was warm on their faces, and the cottonwoods were making their soft rustling sound in the river breeze. And Jonas thought that he had spent 3 years telling himself that his life was complete and satisfying as it was. And he had been, if not entirely wrong, then significantly incomplete in his accounting. He rode back to his own ranch that evening with the particular tiredness that comes from good work done in good company, and he sat on his front porch, watching the mountains go dark against a sky full of stars, and felt content in a way that had texture to it, depth. The way a room feels different when it has furniture in it versus when it is empty. He wrote the full letter to his brother Robert that night and described everything. October arrived and brought with it the deep blue clarity of fall in the territory, cold nights and warm afternoons, and the kind of sky that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Maggie's house took shape with a speed that had everything to do with her planning, and the hiring of 2 skilled adobe workers from Cimarron men named Vicent and his son Louis, who knew the local clay and knew how to build walls that breathed in summer and held heat in winter. Jonas rode over twice a week, not more, because he had his own work and she had hers, and the rhythm they had established seemed to serve them both. He called on her formally, as he had asked permission to, bringing small things, a jar of honey from the Vasquez family who kept bees on the far side of the river, a proper oil lamp from the Cimarron General Store, because the one she had been using was a poor thing that gave uncertain light, a leather-bound journal with good paper in it when he heard her mention that she had nearly filled her sketch pad. She received these things with grace and without embarrassment, because she had sorted out the difference between dependency and kindness somewhere along the way, and Jonas Calloway's gifts were clearly the latter. He learned her middle name, Ruth, for her grandmother, and told her his, which was Elia's, for a great uncle whose sole contribution to the Calloway family legacy was having an interesting name. He learned that she could read in French, having been taught by a teacher in Missouri who believed strongly in the educational broadening effects of languages, and that she had strong opinions about cattle breeds and even stronger opinions about fence construction, and that she could not abide dishonesty in any form, which he found was not a problem since he was, if sometimes excessively blunt, essentially incapable of sustained deception. He told her about the years before the ranch, his time as a trail hand in Texas, the drive from San Antonio to Abilene when he was 23 that had covered him in dust and glory, and taught him more about cattle and human nature than anything before or since. The 2 years he had spent as a deputy in a small Kansas town that had convinced him that what he wanted was land of his own and quiet. The long westward journey that had ended when he had ridden into the Cimarron Valley and felt, for no articulable reason, that he had arrived. She listened to all of it with the attentiveness of someone who was genuinely interested, not performing interest, and she asked questions that were sharp and real. Not the polite questions of conversation, but the questions of someone who wanted to understand the shape of a thing. And he found himself saying things he had not said to anyone, excavating corners of himself he had not bothered with in years. One evening in mid-October, when the house walls were up and the roof was being framed, Jonas arrived at her camp to find her sitting outside in the cooling air, looking at the new walls with the sketching notebook open on her knee. She did not close it this time when he rode up. He sat beside her on the log she had placed as a bench and looked at what she was drawing. It was the house, the walls and the roof beams and the mountains behind, rendered in pencil lines that were precise and yet somehow warm, that captured not just the structure but something about the feeling of it. She had a real gift, he realized. Not the dutiful recording of a homesteader marking progress, but actual artistic vision, the kind that found meaning in what it looked at. "You're very good," he said. "I know," she said, without false modesty, and they both smiled. He put his hand beside hers on the log, not touching, just near, close enough to feel the warmth of her. She looked down at their hands and then looked up at the mountains, and then she turned her head and looked at him with an expression that had nothing calculating or careful in it at all, only a clear, undefended look that went straight through him. He covered her hand with his gently, a question. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over under his and held on. They sat like that for a long time, watching the mountains go through their colors, and did not need to say anything, because the moment was already saying everything that mattered. It was not a swift courtship. Neither of them was the type for swift courtships, and the territory had its own pace, which was determined less by human impatience than by the requirements of seasons and work, and the plain fact that a house had to be built before winter and cattle had to be received, and fences had to be erected, and all of this took priority over the tender business of two people discovering each other, even as that discovery was happening steadily in the margins of every working day. Maggie's 12 head of cattle arrived from Santa Fe in late October, driven by a pair of cowboys she had contracted, who seemed genuinely surprised to find a woman waiting for them at the end of the drive, and then even more surprised when she checked each animal's condition against a written list she had prepared, disputed a claim about one heifer's health with precise and unassailable logic, and negotiated a partial refund on the spot without raising her voice once. Jonas, who had ridden over specifically to be there in case things went sideways, spent most of the time leaning against his horse, watching with an admiration he made no effort to conceal. "You're smiling," Maggie said afterward, when the cowboys had ridden off with somewhat fewer dollars than they had hoped, and her cattle were beginning their acquaintance with their new pasture. "I'm always smiling," he said. "You are absolutely not always smiling," she said, with the easy authority of someone who had been paying attention. "You have what I would describe as a resting expression of serious deliberation." He laughed, which was becoming something he did with increasing frequency in her company, and she looked at him with a satisfaction that she did not bother to hide. Her 2 horses arrived the following week, and with them came a complication. One of the men delivering them, a heavy-set fellow from Santa Fe named Craddock, had apparently misplaced his manners somewhere between the capital and the Cimarron River, and had ideas about a woman alone on 40 acres that he expressed in terms that were deeply unwelcome. Jonas was not there when it happened. He heard about it the next day from Vicent, who had been working on the window frames and had stepped in to provide a physical presence large enough to change the conversation's direction, while Maggie had continued speaking to Craddock in a tone so calmly and precisely devastating that Vicent had described it to Jonas with evident admiration. When Jonas rode over and asked her about it directly, because he was not a man who talked around things, she told him the whole of it with her characteristic exactness and then said, "I have dealt with men like Craddock before and I will deal with them again, but I am glad Vicent was there." A pause. "And I am glad you're asking." He looked at her steadily. "If you ever need me," he said, "send word any time." "I know," she said. I know I can." It was a small exchange and a plain one, and yet it rearranged something between them, settling a level of trust that had been building in stages and now clicked into place like a final piece of something larger. November came and the house was finished. The day Maggie moved out of her camp and into her house, she lit the kitchen fire for the first time and made coffee, and stood in the center of her main room looking at the walls and the windows and the floor she had chosen the boards for herself. And Jonas watched from the doorway because it was her moment, and he did not want to stand in the middle of it, but he wanted to be near the edges of it, which seemed right. She turned to him with shining eyes, not tears or not quite tears, just brightness, and said, "Come in then. You'll let all the cold air in standing in the door." He came in. She had put the rocking chair that had traveled on the outside of her wagon against the south wall, near the window where the light was best. She had arranged her books on a shelf that Vicent had built into the wall beside the fireplace. She had hung, on the eastern wall, a framed sketch she had made. He recognized it now as the view of the mountains from this exact property, drawn on that morning he had found her sketching before they had set out for her land, the morning she had not closed the notebook. She had finished and framed it, and it was remarkable. "You finished it," he said. "It took me a while to get the light right," she said. "The mountains change so much depending on the hour." He looked at the drawing, and then at her, and then at the drawing again. "Maggie," he said. "Jonas," she said. He crossed to where she stood in the middle of her kitchen and took her hands in his, both of them, holding them the way he had the first time, but with more intention now, with the full weight of everything the preceding weeks had built between them. She looked up at him and did not step back, did not put up the careful armor he had watched her wear in those first careful days, only looked at him with the open, undefended directness that he had come to understand was the most intimate thing about her. "I would like to court you formally," he said, "if you're willing." "You've been courting me since the plums," she said with that warm, beginning smile. "I mean formally," he said, "with the intention of asking you at such time as it seems right to both of us to marry me." He watched her face. He had thought, in the weeks of riding over and learning her and building this thing between them, that he had some sense of what she was feeling, some ability to read the language of her expressions. But the face she turned to him in that moment was new, a face he had not seen before, entirely open, entirely present, entirely hers. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He did not kiss her that night. It seemed like something that should wait, not because he did not want to, but because he was a patient man who had learned that the things worth having were worth the waiting, and because the warm press of her hands in his in her new kitchen, with the fire going and the coffee smell in the air, and the mountains framed in her window, was its own kind of perfection that did not need to be rushed past. He kissed her for the first time 3 days later, at dusk, when she was walking back from checking on the cattle, and he had ridden over for no particular reason that would hold up to examination. And they met on the low ridge at the south end of her property, where the red and gold of the sunset was laid out behind them like something painted by someone who wanted to make a point. She looked at him and he looked at her, and they both smiled at the same moment, which he felt was significant. And then he leaned down from Colt's back and she stretched up on her toes, and the kiss was warm and deliberate and entirely themselves, not tentative and not reckless, just right. "Finally," she said when they separated, with the mild exasperation of a woman who had been exercising considerable patience. "Finally," he agreed, and she laughed. Winter in the territory was cold and brilliant and hard in the way that all frontier winters are, a test that the land administers to determine what will survive it. Maggie's house performed well. Vicent and Lewis had built solidly, and her cattle came through in good condition with the supplement feeding she had planned for. Jonas's herd had a bad week in January when a fast-moving ice storm came through, and 3 calves were lost. And Maggie rode over the day after the storm to help with the recovery work without being asked, arriving before dawn in her work, clothes with food in her saddlebag, and the practical energy of someone who understands that help given at the right moment counts for more than help offered after. They worked together through the frozen morning, the two of them in Jonas's hand, a young man from Texas named Billy who was 19 and deeply conscientious. And by midday, the surviving cattle were settled, and Jonas had the distinct warm awareness that the presence of Maggie Wilcox in his north pasture in the freezing January air, working efficiently and without complaint, was not a hardship but something entirely different. "You didn't have to come," he said, when they were warming up with coffee in his kitchen, and Billy had discreetly found something to do in the barn. "I know I didn't have to," she said, with her direct look. "I wanted to." He proposed to her in February. It was not an elaborate proposal. He was not an elaborate man. He had thought about it carefully, turned it over in the long, quiet nights, considered various settings and speeches and rejected all of them as unlike himself. And in the end it happened the way it should have, naturally, in a moment that created its own space. They were sitting on his front porch on a Sunday afternoon, which had become a habit Sunday afternoons on his porch or hers, talking, reading, sometimes in comfortable silence. And the winter sun was making a serious effort. The air was almost mild, and the mountains were the particular deep blue they turned in winter, and Maggie was reading and he was watching her read, which he did sometimes without embarrassment because he enjoyed the quality of her concentration and the way she sometimes moved her lips very slightly over a passage she found particularly interesting. She looked up and caught him watching. "What?" she said. "Marry me," he said. She closed her book around her finger to keep the page. She looked at him steadily. "You asked me this in November," she said. "I asked if I could court you with the intention of asking," he said. "I'm asking now." A long pause in which the mountains did not move and the winter sun continued its effort and a jay somewhere nearby was being loud and inconsiderate. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He took her hand and she squeezed his, and they sat there for a while longer with the mountains and the jay, and it was, Jonas Calloway thought, the finest Sunday afternoon in the recorded history of the New Mexico Territory. They married in April. The ceremony was in Cimarron, in the small church that had been built 3 years before by a congregation that was still in the process of figuring itself out, as frontier congregations tended to be. The minister was a Reverend Abernathy, a spare, kind-faced man from Ohio who had come west with a Bible and a practical theology that accommodated the realities of territory life with more grace than some of his counterparts. He married Jonas and Maggie on a Saturday morning, when the apple trees that someone had optimistically planted along the church fence were making their first tentative blooms. Billy came, wearing his best shirt and looking proud in the specific way that young men look when they care about someone and find themselves in a ceremonial setting that gives them permission to show it. Ezra Howell came with his wife Clara, a stout, cheerful woman who cried at weddings with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in them. Vicent and Louis came, and Vicent's wife Maria, who brought tamales wrapped in cloth for the celebration afterward. 3 neighboring ranching families attended. Maggie's friend from Cimarron, a sharp-minded woman named Eleanor Park, who ran the millinery shop, and had befriended Maggie in November with the speed and certainty of women who recognize each other's quality quickly, sat in the front row and distributed sharp looks to anyone who seemed insufficiently attentive. Maggie walked up the church aisle in a dress she and Eleanor had made together over the winter months, a deep blue, almost the color of evening sky, with a fitted bodice and a narrow collar of white, and her hair up in a way that was somehow both formal and entirely like herself. Jonas stood at the front of the church in his best coat and his cleanest boots, and watched her walk toward him with an expression that Eleanor Park later described to 3 people as the most openly and hopelessly in love face she had ever seen on a man, and she had been in the millinery business for 15 years and seen faces. The vows were the traditional ones. Jonas said his in a steady voice that did not waver, and Maggie said hers in a clear voice that did not either, But when they came to the part about all the days of their lives, something happened in her face, a softness, a fullness, and he could see her breathe it in like it was something she had been reaching toward for a very long time. He kissed his wife in the church doorway with the April light coming in warm and gold around them, and someone, probably a leaner, though this was never confirmed, started the applause. They rode home to his ranch, their ranch, as of today in the afternoon, and Jonas felt the word there as a new texture in everything he looked at. Their fence, their porch, their kitchen, their south pasture, their life. He had not known how much he had been living in a singular sense until the plural arrived and immediately felt like the correct grammar. Maggie stood on the porch for a moment before they went inside, looking out at the land, and he stood beside her, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the mountains going through their late afternoon color changes together. "This is good," she said, simply and completely. "Yes," he said, "it is." The summer of 1875 was a working summer, which all summers in the territory were. They ran the two ranches with a combined efficiency that surprised even Jonas, who had thought his operation was reasonably well organized. Maggie brought a systematic intelligence to the management of animals and resources that complemented his more intuitive approach, and they developed, without formal discussion, a division of labor that played to both their strengths. She handled the records and the purchasing and the forward planning. She had a gift for thinking 3 months ahead, anticipating needs before they became emergencies. And he handled the physical management of the land and the herd with the experience of a man who had been doing it for years. They also made the decision, that summer, to consolidate the two properties, to file the paperwork that would combine her 40 acres and his 320 into a single holding, which required a trip to the land office in Santa Fe, and a day of paperwork, and a modest celebration at a decent hotel dining room that evening, where Maggie wore the blue wedding dress again because, as she explained, she had not gotten enough occasions to wear it yet. Billy stayed on as their hired hand, and in June they took on a second hand, a quiet man named Pedro Estrada who knew horses with the deep specific knowledge of someone who had grown up among them, and whose family had ranched in the territory since before the American acquisition. He and Maggie had a conversation in Spanish one morning over the fence line that Jonas followed about 1 word in 10, and afterward Pedro had the expression of a man who has found himself in excellent professional company. The fall brought a particular joy Jonas had not let himself fully anticipate, because he was, at his core, a man who protected his hopes by keeping them modest until the outcome was certain. Maggie told him one evening in September, a year, almost to the day, since the broken wheel and the scrubland road and the first morning he had ridden past, that they were going to have a child. He had been mending a boot on the porch step, and when she told him, he set the boot and the awl down very carefully, because he did not trust his hands at that moment, and stood up and looked at her in the doorway with the light from inside framing her, and he thought he had never in his life felt anything that large. "When?" he managed. "March, I think," she said, watching him with warm, careful eyes that were checking for his reaction, and he must have had it right because her expression went from careful to glowing in the space of a single breath. He crossed to her and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, and she laughed against his lips and put her arms around his neck, and they stood in the doorway between inside and out, between what was and what was coming, for a long time. He wrote to his brother Robert that night and filled 4 pages. They spent the fall and early winter in the careful, practical, tender way of people who are both getting ready for something enormous and going about their daily business simultaneously. Maggie's approach to pregnancy was consistent with everything else about her, organized and systematic and entirely without self-pity. She continued working modified, as her energy required, but present and engaged, and she read every piece of medical and practical guidance available in the territory, including a correspondence with a woman doctor in Santa Fe named Dr. Helena Reyes, who sent letters with advice that was, for 1875, remarkably progressive and sensible. Jonas, for his part, discovered that he was a man who worried with considerable thoroughness, but expressed that worry primarily through action, fixing things, building things, improving things. He built an addition to the east side of the house with a room that caught the morning light, and he lined the floor with a smooth adobe plaster that would be warm and easy to clean. And he built a cradle from cedar wood that took him 3 weeks because he kept adding small details, a carved ridge along the side rail, small fitted corner pieces, a base that rocked with the exact right resistance. In January, his brother Robert arrived from Texas. Robert Calloway was 34 years old, taller than Jonas by 2 inches and louder in every conversation by about the same proportion, with the same dark eyes and their mother's jaw, and a forthright warmth that announced itself the moment he rode into the yard. He and Maggie shook hands on first meeting and sized each other up with the mutual alertness of 2 people who were both deeply protective of Jonas, and then Robert said, "You're exactly what I hoped for when he wrote to me." And Maggie said, "He writes about you constantly, you know." And they were friends from that point forward in the easy way of people who have come to the same place from different directions. Robert stayed through the winter. He helped with the cattle work and the fence line and the general operations of a ranch that was running at the edge of its 2-person capacity. And in return, he ate well and slept in the spare room, and had the considerable pleasure of watching his brother, who had been a contained and self-sufficient and mildly lonely man for the better part of a decade, become someone visibly, continuously, matter-of-factly happy. "She did that," Robert said one evening, sitting with Jonas on the porch while the winter stars were putting on their performance. "I know it," Jonas said. "You almost rode past her," Robert said, because Jonas had told him the whole story every day of it. "I know that too," Jonas said. "That was almost the worst decision of your life." "It was the worst decision of my life," Jonas said. "I just didn't make it 7 times in a row." The baby came in March on a Tuesday, which Maggie said afterward was appropriate since the whole thing had started on a Tuesday. The birth was long and difficult in the way that first births sometimes are, and Jonas spent the hours in the combined states of practical usefulness and white-knuckled anxiety, keeping the fire, boiling water, holding Maggie's hand when she wanted it and stepping back when she did not. The woman who came to assist, a Mexican midwife named Dolores, who had attended hundreds of births in the territory and had the unflappable calm of someone who had seen everything possible, managed the whole proceeding with serene competence. Their son was born at 3:30 in the morning, into a house full of firelight and lamplight, and the particular charged quiet of a night that has accomplished something. He was red-faced and vocal, and had, according to Robert, Jonas's ears and Maggie's expression of outright determination already in place before he was 5 minutes old. They named him Theodore Elias Calloway, Theodore for Maggie's first husband, whom she had loved and lost and had made peace within the architecture of her new life, and Elias for Jonas's gray tuncle with the interesting name, and Calloway because that was who they were. Jonas held his son for the first time in the gray morning light, just before dawn, when Dolores had tidied everything and Maggie was resting, and Robert had quietly made coffee and quietly brought it and quietly left again. And he stood at the window with Theodore Elias against his chest and looked at the mountains that were just beginning to catch the first pale light. He thought about a September morning a year and a half ago, a road and a broken wheel and a woman with her hands on her hips and a jaw set against the world, and a man on a gray horse who nearly did not stop. Nearly. He thought about all the nearly things in life, the conversations nearly not started, the hands nearly not taken, the moments nearly missed, and how the entire difference between a good life and a diminished one sometimes lived in a single decision to stop rather than ride on. Theodore made a small sound of protest, and Jonas adjusted his hold and the baby subsided. And outside, the mountains were gold now in the first real light of morning, and Maggie's voice came quietly from the bed behind him. "How does he look?" she asked. Jonas turned to her. She was propped against the pillow, exhausted and perfect, watching him with those warm brown eyes that had been measuring and learning him for a year and a half now and knew him as well as he knew himself. "He looks like his mother," Jonas said. Maggie smiled, the real smile, the unguarded one that he had first heard on a September afternoon and had been working to earn every day since. "Come here, then," she said. "Both of you." He crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she leaned against his side and looked at their son, and the mountains held their light, and it was good. It was deeply, completely, irreversibly good. The spring that followed was the kind of spring that makes the hard winters worth surviving. The land came back green, and there were lambs on the neighboring Hendricks ranch that Billy reported on with more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. And the cattle were fat, and the fence line that Jonas and Pedro had worked all winter to improve held its first real test against a May windstorm with complete satisfaction. Maggie was back on horseback 6 weeks after Theodore's birth, though Jonas had exercised considerable restraint in keeping his opinions about this timeline to himself, having learned over 18 months of marriage that Maggie Wilcox Calloway's relationship with her own body's capabilities was not a topic that benefited from his editorial contributions. She carried Theodore in a cloth carrier she had designed herself, adapted from a design she had seen on a Pueblo woman in Taos the previous summer, and she rode out on the range with him against her chest and the mountains surrounding them. And Jonas, watching from the porch as she rode out one morning, had the involuntary thought that she was the most magnificent thing the territory had ever produced, though it had not produced her. It had only had the good sense to receive her. Robert left in June, with regret on all sides and a standing invitation to return that was meant and accepted. He had, in his months at the ranch, become genuinely attached to Theodore, who was a responsive and good-natured baby when not being hungry, and he had told Maggie at least 4 times that she had performed a service for the entire Calloway line by tolerating his brother's reclusiveness long enough to get through to the good parts. There was always good parts, Maggie had said, to which Robert had given Jonas a sidelong look, and Jonas had said nothing because there was nothing useful to add. Summer deepened, and the work of the ranch was good work, the kind that tires the body and satisfies the mind and builds something real. They added 6 head to the combined herd from a sale in Cimarron. They replaced the old fence on the north pasture. They put in a proper vegetable garden that Maggie tended with the kitchen garden exactness she had described on the second day he had ever seen her, and which produced, by August, more tomatoes than 2 adults and 1 infant could reasonably consume, leading to a significant gift of tomatoes to a leaner park, and to Vicent's family, and to Doller's and to Billy, who was not certain he liked tomatoes but appreciated the gesture. In August, Jonas finished the letter about the ranch's first full consolidated year and sent it to Robert, and included in it a sketch that Maggie had made of the ranch from the ridge, the house, the barn, the cattle in the south pasture, the mountains behind it, all done in the precise, warm style that was entirely her own. He mentioned in the letter that they were hoping for another child, and that Theodore had recently discovered he had hands and was finding this fascinating. On a warm evening in late August, Jonas and Maggie sat on the front porch as the day went down, Theodore asleep in his cradle inside with the window open so they could hear him, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with its colors, red and gold and a deep, saturated pink, and Maggie had her sketch notebook on her knee but was not drawing, only looking. "Do you remember the first time I rode past you?" Jonas asked. She did not look up from the sky immediately. "Of course I do," she said. "You touched your hat at me and kept riding. I almost stopped." "I know," she said, and now she turned her head and looked at him with the full weight of everything she was, the stubbornness and the intelligence and the tenderness and the undefended directness and the jaw and the warm brown eyes and the laugh he had been chasing since he had first heard it. I could tell every single morning. He looked at her. Could you? You always slowed down, she said. Not enough to commit to stopping, but enough to look. Every day, a small smile. I knew you would stop eventually. He felt a laugh in his chest. You did not. I did, she said with serene certainty. I thought it would be sooner, actually. I thought day 3 or 4. But then I realized you were more stubborn than I initially assessed. Or less confident, he said. She reached across the small space between their chairs and found his hand in the fading light. No, she said. I think it was patience. You were waiting until you were sure. He held her hand, and the sky burned out its colors into blue and then dark, and the first stars came through. And inside the house their son slept in the cedar cradle, and the mountains were a dark presence on every horizon, and Jonas Calloway sat on the porch of his life and knew it was the right life, fully and exactly right, the kind of rightness that does not depend on the absence of difficulty, but exists alongside it as the deeper truth. I should have stopped sooner, he said. You stopped when you stopped, she said, and here we are, here they were. In the years that followed, and they were good years, most of them, built from hard work and solid affection, and the particular intimacy of two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of who they are choosing. The ranch grew, and the family grew, and the life they made together accumulated the richness that comes from being well-made in the first place. Theodore grew into a brown-eyed, quick-minded boy who had his mother's way of looking at everything as though it were a problem to be understood, and his father's way of working hard without complaint, and who at age 4 had decided that his father's horse Colt was his personal friend, a position Colt accepted with geriatric equanimity. A second child came in the winter of 1878, another boy, James Robert Calloway, named for Jonas's father and his brother, red-haired like some ancestor whose contribution to the genetic record had skipped several generations before surfacing here in New Mexico territory. Loud and demanding and absolutely certain of his own rightness from the first hour of his life. Robert came back from Texas for James's birth and stayed 3 weeks and wrote home to his own wife. He had married in 1877, that he had never seen two people so well suited to each other and to the life they had built, and that the ranch was the finest place in the territory, and that he was coming back the following summer whether invited or not. He was always invited. Maggie kept drawing. She filled notebooks throughout those years, the ranch in every season, the mountains in every light, Theodore's face as a newborn and then as a toddler, James's red hair catching the sun, Jonas at the fence line in the early morning, Jonas at the kitchen table with a letter, Jonas on the porch watching the sky. She sent some of the drawings to her sister in St. Louis, who wrote back that they were extraordinary and that she could likely sell them if she wished. Maggie did not wish to sell them. They were for keeping. She also taught herself to paint, from a book she ordered through the general store in Cimarron, and from a correspondence with an artist in Santa Fe, who exchanged letters with her over the course of 2 years on the subjects of light and color and technique. By 1879, there were paintings on the walls of the ranch house that people who visited commented on with genuine feeling, not the polite comments of people being kind, but the surprised, reaching comments of people encountering something that affects them in a way they had not anticipated. Eleanor Park, who had become the kind of friend who required no ceremony and could be relied upon in all seasons, told anyone who would listen that Maggie Calloway was a genuine talent who was also running a ranch and raising 2 boys. And Eleanor said it with the proprietary pride of someone who had recognized quality early and wanted credit for her discernment. One evening in the fall of 1879, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet with the deep particular quiet of a frontier evening, Jonas was sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts and Maggie was at the south window with her paints, working on something he had not yet been permitted to see, and the lamp was burning warm and the fire was low and the mountains were invisible in the dark but present, as they always were, in the knowing. "I need to see the painting," he said. "You'll see it when it's finished," she said without looking up. "When will it be finished?" "When it's right." He made an accepting sound and returned to the accounts. After a while she said, "Jonas, I think I'm with child again." He set the pen down. He had become, over the years, somewhat better at not immediately knocking things over when she told him significant things. He turned in his chair and looked at her. She was looking at him over her shoulder with her paint brush in her hand, and her expression was the open, undefended one, the one she had first shown him in November of 1874 in her new kitchen with the coffee smell in the air, the one that was entirely present and entirely hers. "When?" he said. "Spring again," she said. "Late spring, I think." He got up from the table and crossed to her, and she set down her brush and turned to him. And he held her, there in the lamplight with the night and the mountains outside and the sleeping boys down the hall. And he was grateful in a way that had no bottom to it, grateful in every direction at once. Their daughter was born in May of 1880, Clara Marie Calloway, named for Ezra Howell's kind wife who had cried at weddings, because Maggie felt it was a name that deserved to be passed on. She was quiet and observant from the beginning, with Jonas's gray eyes and Maggie's dark hair, and a quality of watching the world that suggested she was taking extensive notes. Theodore, who was 5, regarded her with the air of someone who has received a responsibility he had not requested, but intended to fulfill properly. James, who was 2, and did not fully understand the concept, patted her head with a force that required some redirection. Ezra Howell, when he came to see the baby and learned her name, wept without embarrassment, which was entirely consistent with his character, and Clara Howell said it was the finest compliment she had ever received, and brought an extraordinary quilt she had made over the winter that Maggie kept on Clara Marie's bed until the girl was old enough to go to school and still kept afterward, folded in the cedar chest. The ranch was well established now, deeply rooted, 360 acres of good New Mexico land with a solid house, and a proper barn and cattle that numbered over 100 head, and a reputation in the Cimarron Valley for the quality of their stock and the reliability of their word, which Jonas had always considered the most important business asset a ranch could have. Pedro Estrada had become, over the years, more partner than employee in the daily practical sense, and his knowledge of the land and the horses had expanded the operation in ways that simple additional labor would not have. Billy had eventually, at the age of 24, married a girl from Cimarron named Amy, who worked in her family's dry goods store and had excellent judgment about people. And Jonas had offered them the use of the small foreman's house he had built at the edge of the south pasture, which they accepted with happiness and inhabited with the energetic commitment of young people making their first real home. The territory itself was changing around them, in the way that frontiers change, never entirely peaceful, always contested, the complicated and often painful business of a land that was home to many peoples long before the homesteaders arrived. Jonas and Maggie had watched the politics of land and power play out through the 1870s, with the mixed feelings of people who were themselves settlers, and who also could not entirely not see the human cost of the broader movement they were part of. They treated the Jicarilla Apache families they encountered with the basic respect they tried to extend to everyone, bought from Mexican families in the area and hired from them, pushed back when they heard of abuses from other ranchers, understood that their own comfortable tenure on their acres did not exist independent of a much larger and more painful history. It was not a simple position to occupy, and they did not pretend it was. In 1881, the Santa Fe Ring, the political machine of lawyers and land speculators that had been manipulating land grants and legal processes throughout the territory for years, made an attempt to challenge the deed on a parcel of land adjacent to the Calloway Ranch that was in fact legitimately owned by the Garcia family, their neighbors to the south. Jonas and Maggie both appeared at the land hearing in Cimarron, and Jonas, gave testimony regarding his direct knowledge of the Garcia family's continuous occupation and improvement of the land. And Maggie had organized a written record of the adjacent deed history that the lawyer opposing the ring found invaluable, and the Garcia family kept their land. It was not a large victory in the scheme of the territory's politics, but it was a real one, and afterwards Consuela Garcia, who was 60 years old and had been on her land since before the American territory designation, and was not a woman who spent emotion carelessly, took Maggie's hand in both of hers and said something in Spanish that Maggie translated for Jonas later as roughly, "You are a good neighbor and a good person, and I am glad you came to this valley." "So am I," Jonas had said, meaning everything. That evening they sat on the porch, their habitual Sunday evening porch sitting having become their habitual most evenings porch sitting, whenever the season permitted, and the children were inside with the lamp, Theodore reading aloud to Clara Marie, while James sat nearby making his own editorial comments on the text, and the mountains were doing their evening thing, and Maggie was leaning against Jonas's shoulder with her sketchbook balanced on her knee, not drawing, just holding it. "We did a good thing today," she said. "You did the work," he said, "the deed records. You showed up," she said, "both matter." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She made a small sound of contentment and tipped her head back against his shoulder. Out in the pasture, the cattle were settling for the night, and the first stars were taking their positions, and the air smelled of sage and coming fall. He thought, as he sometimes did, about that Tuesday morning in September of 1874, the first morning, and the woman with her hands on her hips beside a broken wheel on a scrubland road in the territory. He thought about 6 mornings of riding past and the 7th morning of stopping, and the rippling consequences of that stopping that had moved outward through time like rings on still water, the coffee, the plums, the conversations, the hand in his, the kitchen, the vows in the apple-blossom church, the children inside reading by lamplight. He thought about all the things that might not have been, and then he set that thought down because the better thought, the one worth keeping, was all the things that were. "Maggie," he said. She tilted her head to look up at him. "Jonas," she said, with the familiar warmth, the familiar ease. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she smiled, the real one, the unguarded one, the one that had caught him like a hook on that September afternoon and had not let him go since, and that he had long since stopped wanting to be free of. "Thank you," she said back. The mountains held their color until the last of the light was gone, and the children's voices drifted out through the window, and somewhere in the south pasture Colt moved through the dark with the unhurried certainty of an old horse who knows his ground, and the night settled over the Calloway ranch with the full, peaceful weight of a life well lived, a life made from a broken wheel and a scrubland road, and a man who had finally, on the 7th day, stopped.